RuneScape is a game that has a lot of items. So many items, in fact, that it'd be impossible for a person to have all of them at once, especially considering the bank space constraints. But what if you could own every item? How much would it cost to obtain everything? Well, today we're gonna find out. Obviously, I can skip the explanation of what an item is, but we should parameterize what exactly we're looking for here. I mean, we're trying to own a copy of every version of every item. So when it comes to something like potions, we have to count the cost of each individual dose amount. And, for example, the Grazi Rapier, well, we need to count 2 of those, one for the normal version, one for the recolored version. This does not apply to noted versions of items, however. One would think you just need to look at the GE data to figure it out. And although many of the items that one can get are in the Grand Exchange, there are simply a lot that just can't be purchased. So in order to get to the bottom of this, we're going to do some intensive research on all 25,000 entries in the game's item ID system. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of object-oriented programming, but pretty much every version of every item is stored as a different item, where the key difference in coding is the unique ID that is given to it, which we're going to call the item ID system. A good example of understanding how this works is to look at how the game handles the canon. We're going to be using OSRSBox, an item database that is nearly up to date with all the items in the game. So looking at our canon pieces, we can see that the IDs are IDs 6 through 11, where there are 2 of each canon piece. These 2 versions each represent the normal and noted versions of these items. Scrolling down further, in the results for the canon, we can even find more IDs that are of much higher value, have the same name and code, and are slightly different. If you guess that these duplicates are for the new League canon, then you'd be correct. You may also notice that some of these items in the list, well, in some shape or form they're scrap content, or have names that don't sync up with the item's name and game, or are just, can be anything, really. From items used in animations, to things that show up in the chat box, even Slayer mob icons and agility shortcuts are considered items in the system. Of course, there's also a little bit of pedanticism in the item ID system itself. We could worry about this, but instead we're just going to go for one of every item and not count the versions, which is multiples of the same item. For example, a stack of coins versus a single coin. I would also like to leave a disclaimer that this research took a little over a week of consistently looking at wiki values for things, so this price is not going to be accurate forever. In fact, it probably isn't even accurate because it took place between December 7th and December 15th. But even though this is the case, I still believe the number that we have is at least 99% accurate towards the actual total. Starting off, I decided to go ahead and create an Excel sheet to keep track of prices with the relevant column names. And it seems like the only things that should really matter to us is the item name, the ID, the price, and if that price is from the GE or not. There's also going to be a little bit of notes that I put off to the side occasionally for some items, just for extra data that you might need for how this price was created. And now we can finally begin with, well, we're still on the cannon. So the cannon, the cannonball, and ammo molds will be our first items here. From here we move on to the Holy Grail, Clock Tower, and finally all unstrung items. Every time we then move on 500 quest items once again for Temple of Ivankov, Fight Arena, and move into the unfinished potions and potions of every shape and size category that were there when Herblore was released. And yep, it is as big and frustrating of a category as you'd expect.
I can't take it anymore! I just want to die! We all want to die!
And we may have just breezed through about 1,000 entries on this ID system, but yeah, that was a few days work. So obviously, brute forcing our way through each of the entries is just not going to fly here. So we had to do something to optimize this process. Firstly, looking around OSRSBox, we can find a link to their GitHub page where they have all of their files and the API posted. From here, I was able to download the correlating files that I could locally host this server, which will allow me to do more advanced filtering on our data set, removing both noted and placeholder IDs so that we'll only have our unique IDs of normal items. In technicality, the rest of this could also be automated if one was determined enough, but the price points coming from various different nested entries on the wiki, it'd be a little difficult to implement and would probably take more time than it did for me to make this. So I decided to go on with filling the data manually from here to ensure that everything works out properly and to help in deciding some of the factors on what items would and would not count. And Well shit, there's a lot of liberties here. Let's take a look at some of these things going on with this item ID system. Basically, every single interactable has an item ID. Even your spells are here, so there's a lot of blank wiki searching that can occur, especially when in the system it does not specify the difference between a teleport spell and a teleport item tablet. This type of problem is occurring throughout all of this database, with things such as the Nightmare Zone items that spawn like the anti-dragon shield, which surprisingly is a unique version of this item that is identical in every single way to the actual anti-dragon shield, so the code can sometimes just mess with you for these very specific conditions. There's a lot to get confused by when trying to calculate the cost of everything this way, but there's also a lot to learn by looking at this database. Not only can we see that the majority of the item ID system is in release order, but functional items are where one could learn the most. Take a look at the Clan Wars capes, for example, an unobtainable item that's automatically equipped to your jaw to achieve team cape effects without wearing one in the minigame itself. We're allowed to see what type of programming trickery is performed to keep some of the pieces of content working, and this is just a single example of the wacky things that we just typically don't. What the fuck? Of course, there weren't just problems with gathering our data and finding the correct lowest prices, but also with the design of this question. We ask how much does it cost to own everything, which as we've discussed by this point is one of everything. But when we say everything, what do we mean by everything? Is having the bronze armor set the same as having each bronze piece of armor individually? Will there still be limitations of the game's mechanics involved? Will every item count differently with the amount of charges it can hold? Well, with things coming together, we needed to draw the line in the sand somewhere. So, we will be buying one of everything, meaning yes, you will not only need to own big items, but each individual piece that is required to own it. The limitations of max capes will remain, meaning you can have one untrimmed cape, but also still allowed to get all of the trimmed capes. Items that can be imbued will be counting in both their imbued and normal forms, and charged weapons will only be counted for their non-charged state unless they can be permanently charged, like the Botha. This means something like the Ring of Suffering that can be imbued and also given a Ring of Recoil will have 4 versions of the Rings of Suffering, one that's normal and then imbued and then the recoil and then the imbued recoil. And with all of these guidelines finally placed and put together, the majority of calculations could be put down to about 99.9% of the cases finally creating a number that works. But I'm sure some of the astute viewers are curious how we handled the Third Age pickaxe. You see, the Third Age pickaxe costs more than the max cash stack in this game. There are very few in game, and honestly, I'm just not in the communities that are god tier enough to even utter the phrase Third Age. So I did the best that I could with what I was given. I just popped over to the OSRS forums, and we could see a pricing battle going on currently while this was being put together, somewhere between the line of 3.45 billion and 3.8 billion. And since I'm not gonna wait for them to come to the deal, I'm just gonna lowball and say that it was 3.5 bill. And after a string of a lot of things, we could finally get a calculation of... Hey, wait a minute. These aren't the names of the Tombs of Amasket's rewards? Because in fact, OSRSBox was discontinued over a year ago. So the fact that I even got it working was a miracle because of the community that was still there on GitHub to help out. So from here, we began browsing the wiki without the item ID system, and just do everything based off of the updates that have come out this year, which reminded me, oh shit, Next isn't even a year old! So we add the Next drops, we add the few Guardians of the Rift tradables, and we finally add the real Tombs of Amasket's rewards to finally get our number. 30,976,382,699 GP. That is how much it costs to own everything that can be purchased or built with purchased materials between the average prices of the data from December 7th to December 15th, with the only items not being counted being burnt food, because only delinquents and streamers pay for burnt food. And now, with all this done, I can finally use my forbidden knowledge to make mass amounts of profit.
3 weeks later.
Hey Charlie? Can you spare some gold?